about the Asian youth movement because when Amit and the guys from Consented asked me to speak, I was trying to think about what it was that I felt was quite often missing when we talk about the history of anti-racism in Britain. And I remembered that when I discovered the Asian youth movements, I felt really shocked that this was not information I'd had access to before. So I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, and when in that time there was talk of Asians and politics, it was all focused on representation, so whether or not there were Asian characters on EastEnders, and whether or not they were good Asian characters on EastEnders, whether or not there were Asian MPs, whether or not we had good coverage in the papers, the lack of Asian athletes, this kind of stuff. It was all about that. The brief success of some British Asian musicians was a source of real pride, and that dissipated quite quickly. And so a lot of this was really not explicitly political. It was about belonging, largely. It was about being part of the nation, right? It was about being British. And in many ways, it was a question of the acceptance by the white mainstream. So it was about whether or not you were deemed to belong. And in order to determine that, you had to be seen as good immigrants, right? You had to be seen as people that contributed to the country. And so then when you were represented on EastEnders, it was a mark of your inclusion. And so then when I discovered the Asian youth movements, I saw a totally different history. Because what I saw was something that was collective. So it wasn't about individual success, it wasn't about role models, it wasn't about having a single person to look at and say, yeah, this guy made it and he's one of ours. Instead, it was about something that was militant, it was collective, and it wasn't beholden to anyone. It wasn't asking for something to be given, it was taking what was felt to be rightfully ours. So I thought, okay, that's something to think about, right? That's something quite different than the kinds of politics I was seeing at the end of the 90s and in the early 2000s. So I will start with a clip from Sivanandan, who in the last session John referred to as the legendary Sivanandan. I think that's really the only introduction he needs. So I think I'll play what he says, and I think this is kind of how I'm going to try and understand the Asian youth movements.
Resistance, in a sense, has always had a time lag. And that is partly because we have never been able to come to terms with the history that we made in order to be able to catch history on the wings and resist at that particular moment of time in a way that we could bring about social change. But the changes have come. They have added up. You don't think the black bourgeoisie that we have today in this country pulled itself up by its own bootstraps. Right? They rode on the backs of the kids who burned down the city. Right. Even I wouldn't be able to have a job if those kids didn't do things in Bristol and Handsworth and Mosside and Liverpool East. Right. That doesn't mean that is the way forward, because we need to have constructive, creative ways of changing society.
Okay, so when I heard that, I started to get a better sense of why it was that we saw this representation on TV and in politics a little bit, right? Because that black pussy bourgeoisie rose on the backs of those kids that burnt down the cities. And suddenly it was like, it wasn't just hard work, it wasn't just that we became like good, respectable immigrants, it was that something had to happen to make those stories of individual success possible. And I think the Asian youth movements are a big part of that story. I think we also get a sense from this that resistance isn't always legible as such. So when resistance is happening, we don't always recognise it as resistance. And so those forms of street mobilisation, of civil unrest, need to be transformed and built upon. But the task must be that we do so, we transform those moments of spontaneous street protest, of things that we like to call riots. We transform them, but we don't erase them. We don't disavow them. We don't say, now we've become respectable and that stuff doesn't matter. And so I think that what we need to think about then is the way that different forms of resistance become legible at different moments, become different ways of, as Sivanandan says, catching history on the wing. So the Asian youth movements form at the end of the 70s and they continue until kind of the mid to the end of the 80s. And they're formed by the children of first generation migrants mostly, some of whom also migrated themselves as children. Most have come to work in the mills, and some served in World War II. And there was a need in the sort of end of the 60s to try and bring kids and wives over quickly, because it was mostly single men at first, because the immigration laws were changing. So there was a need to kind of get in before the borders were shut. And so because these young people were listening to their parents, they had a real sense that what was going on in Britain was linked to the anti-colonial struggles elsewhere. So they weren't reading about the anti-colonial struggle in India as a kind of thing in history books. They were hearing about it from their parents and grandparents, their uncles and aunts. And they brought some of that politics with them. But they were also really influenced by ongoing anti-colonial struggles. And I think that's something that John touched on earlier. And I think in particular looking at South Africa and Ireland was really key. So that was the sort of context of the time. And the Asian youth movements had groups all over the country. So in Manchester, in Sheffield, in Southall, in Tower Hamlets, in Haringey, and also in places that we don't often talk about in terms of the history of political struggle. So in Burnley and in Bolton, there were Asian youth movement groups, right? So if we want to think about the history of British anti-racism, we can't always do so from the perspective of London. Well, I'm going to give you some information on kind of a few of the key events and campaigns in that period. I'm going to focus on the Asian youth movements in Bradford and in Southall, partly because there is more information about that. So an academic called Anandi Murthy's put together a really brilliant archive, and a lot of the material she gathered was from Bradford. And there's a film called Young Rebels made by young people in Southall that catalogues the struggle, that kind of shows you and interviews lots of the elders, or the people that are now elders that were involved as teenagers. So there's more information about those groups, so that's why I'm drawing on them the most. But also because they took slightly different forms. So the Bradford Asian Youth Movements group was kind of more explicitly political from the start, so a lot of them had been involved in other kinds of organising, and they ran the organisation a little bit like the Communist Party. So it was a kind of membership organisation, and you had to be nominated by someone, you had to go to a certain number of meetings, and if you brought the organisation into disrepute by getting really drunk after a meeting, then you got sort of stern telling off from someone in charge, right? So it was a little bit more disciplined. Whereas the Southall group took on a more immediately social character, and they were very much about defending their neighbourhood, so dealing with the immediate local social problems. And the Southall movement formed because a 17-year-old boy called Gurdeep Singh Chugga was killed in 1976 by a group of white racists who were never apprehended. And the National Front leader at the time, a guy called John Kingsley Reid, said, "One down, 1 million to go." Amazingly, he was acquitted of the crime of inciting racial hatred the next year, and the judge made some kind of tedious statement about free speech. Maybe that's something that's starting to sound familiar too. And so the day after his murder, with Chugga's blood still staining the streets of Southall, 7,000 people come out to protest. Maybe I've got an image. Yeah, so this was the protest in 1976. It's really big. It's the biggest the community had seen to that point. And there was a real understanding of the way in which this murder was linked to the general call in British politics at the time that said, "Send them back." So some of the banners that day read, "Here to stay." So there was a sense that there was a real connection between the politics of the border, the politics of immigration, and the politics of violence on the street by racist gangs. So there was a sense that those things were really deeply connected. And the next day, the Southall Youth Movement was formed. So they squatted a building, and they were then given very cheap access to that building, because the owner was an Indian businessman in the area of good standing in the community, and he didn't want the sort of trouble that they might bring if he said no. So they weren't afraid to challenge their own, right? They weren't afraid to challenge the more conservative elements in their own community. And the kinds of work they did initially was really about community self-defence. So if a shop or a restaurant was having some trouble with gangs of white racists, a group of guys would just go and protect that business. Same if some kids were having some trouble at school, a couple of guys would just come and walk them home from school, right? So it really operated as a kind of, in the first instance, almost doing security. And so that's not necessarily something that now I think we see as kind of political action, but actually it was a really important first step, because people had immediate needs that weren't being met. The police were not going to protect them from racist violence, so the community had to do it themselves. It also meant that it had a pretty macho character in the first instance, and that acted as a pretty severe limitation on the kind of work that was going to come out of the Southall Youth Movement. And then in 1979, the National Front once again wanted to make their way into Southall, and there was a huge demonstration against that, which ended with a real kind of orgy of police brutality. So there were 342 arrests. Now, if anyone's ever gone on an anti-fascist demo in recent years, sometimes there's a load of arrests and it will be 60 arrests or 70 arrests. And that's seen as really shocking. And it is really shocking. But 342 arrests on that one day was really unprecedented, really massive. There was also a very tragic death of a young anti-fascist activist, a guy called Blair Peach, who was a teacher from New Zealand, who died from head injuries suffered when the Special Patrol Group were just beating people, and no officers were ever charged over his death, but a much more recent report said that he was almost certainly killed by one of the Special Patrol Group officers, and that was almost certainly covered up by one of his colleagues. So the day after Blair Peach's death, 10,000 people marched past the place where he was killed, and they carried his body to the Dominion Cinema in Southall, which is a big kind of centre of the community. So this was something that really, as you can see from the photo, the whole community was involved in. It wasn't just the youth movements, but they really spearheaded some stuff, but it was also all of these older people in the area. A couple of years later, with these deaths still like ringing in the community's ears, skinheads once again set their sights on Southall. And so there was a skinhead band called the Foreskins, which is really something. And they were booked to play at a pub in Southall called the Hambra Tavern. And the community in Southall said, look, every time something like this happens, like, we get beaten up, our area is destroyed, windows get smashed, people in our community are harassed. And they went to the guy that owned the pub and said, can you just cancel this, please? Like, this is where we live, you just need to be a bit more respectful of that. The guy didn't cancel it, and of course it ended in, this time I think there was a real confidence in the community in Southall, and people were like, no, we're not going to stand for this. So people came out in force, and what ended up happening is that some of the young people had prepared petrol bombs, and when it looked like the police were not going to do anything to stop the skinheads, someone threw a petrol bomb and the Hambra Tavern burnt down. Now, this is not generally the story that people tell about the resistance in Southall. The focus is always on Blair Peach, and I think that's right. I think it's right that that moment of resistance and of community solidarity is focused on. But I think it's also worth knowing that when the police didn't intervene and when there was no way of achieving peaceful negotiation to end this kind of violence, the community had to take the matters into their own hands. And in the film Young Rebels, that's made by the young people in Southall, a lot of people they interview talk about how older people, uncles and aunties, came out the next day to see the kind of burning embers of this pub and felt that pride in the fact that their young people had fought back. And so I think we have to be careful not to forget those moments of really like direct taking matters into your own hands. In other parts of the country, the movement was also building. So soon after this happened in Southall, it seemed that skinheads were, like the kind of group of racist National Front activists, were going to go to Manningham, which is Bradford's main Asian area. And this had already happened a couple of times before, and the youth had tried to defend their neighbourhood other times, and they got ready to do it again. But by this point, the Asian youth movement in Bradford was already quite well established. They had an office, they had people working there, they already kind of knew what they were about. And then the recently formed United Black Youth League, again, that idea of political blackness that John Ryan spoke about this morning, and they were very closely affiliated with the Asian youth movements. They responded by mobilising the youth and organising in the community defence. Once again, some members of the community prepared some petrol bombs in case they needed to use them, which in the end they didn't. But some weeks after, these unused petrol bombs were found in someone's shed, I think, and 12 activists from the United Black Youth League were arrested in dawn raids across the sea, and they were charged with conspiracy. A 13th activist, a young woman called Shahnaz Ali, was also arrested, so it could very nearly have been the Bradford 13. But in her understanding of what happened, the police saw her in a Salwar kameez and thought, we'll never get away with this. So they thought it would be much easier to convict a group of 12 men than 12 men and this young Muslim woman. So they decided that wasn't going to work, so they let her go without charge. And a huge campaign was mobilised around the Bradford 12. So up and down the country, there was real support garnered. And there was lots of debate about what their defence should be. And in the end, they did something really bold that people really hadn't tried before. And they pleaded not guilty on the grounds of necessity. And they used the rallying cry that self-defence is no offence. So they said, we're not guilty. Yeah, we made petrol bombs. And yeah, we were going to use them. But we don't believe that we are guilty, because if we cannot be defended by the police or by the state, then we must defend ourselves. And they used the court as a way of explaining the reality of immigrant communities in Britain. So they used the court as a kind of platform, both to explain to the jury, but also to the press who are in the gallery. So you then have the opportunity to tell a different story. And unbelievably, and quite brilliantly, the Bradford 12 won their case. So they were acquitted. And in doing so, they set that precedent of saying that self-defence is no offence. So that's one of the posters after they won the case. And so in addition to these kinds of immediate mobilisations against street violence, they also organised around immigration cases. So the Birmingham group, and I really love this story, took on the case of Baba Baktora, who was a Punjabi folk singer. And so he was well known and liked in the community because he sung at events and he sung at weddings. And he was facing deportation, but his case wasn't getting any traction. So the Birmingham group, the Asian youth movements in Birmingham, got involved. And they were trying to work out a way to bring some kind of attention to his case. And they realised that there was a really strange and I think like peculiarly British loophole in the law, which meant that he didn't, as a Commonwealth citizen, have the right to reside in Britain. But he did have the right to run for political office. So they put him up as an MP in Birmingham. And so he's running for office. He's running to be a Member of Parliament in Birmingham while he's also facing deportation. And again, they used this as a way to build attention, bring people together, gave them a platform to campaign on. And obviously he lost. Apparently the Labour candidate who won like the full, she won like 36,000 votes or something, and he won 300. But apparently she came in after she won and bought everyone in the pub a drink except the people that had campaigned for this guy. So I think that's kind of extraordinary to think about, right? That this woman who knew that she was going to win the seat, she won the seat by a landslide and still had that kind of bitterness and resentment and just outright racism, that she couldn't see that what they were doing was a kind of strategy. So in taking on these cases and taking on these immigration cases, they were also able to build kinds of solidarity with other groups and also to protect the older members of the community and build up a sense of trust and of solidarity between people that wouldn't necessarily be involved in the youth movement's other kinds of organising. So most famously, the Asian youth movement supported a woman called Anwars to reunite with her children. I won't explain, I'm just going to play this short clip, which I think is probably more useful and you get to hear it.
I was born in Birmingham, brought up in Rochdale. I was sent to Pakistan in 1962. I was married in 1968. I had 3 children there. And my husband came to England in 1973. I followed him in 75. And after the birth of my 4th child, that's where all my hell of the life began.
When Anwar tried to bring her first 3 children from Pakistan to join her, the authorities refused them entry. The Home Office became suspicious about a discrepancy in Anwar's story. Anwar had married her husband twice, once under Islamic law in Pakistan, then 7 years later under British law. The first time she'd only been 15 and they'd lied about her age, so Anwar's date of birth was different on the 2 marriage certificates.
They said there's 2 Anwaditas. One Shujauddin married in Pakistan, the second one that he married in Rochdale. My answer to that was, I'm the same person.
Anwar's children had to remain in Pakistan for 6 years while she campaigned against the Home Office's refusal to admit them to Britain.
I had to go to give fingerprints and thumbprints. I gave them photographs, I gave them loads of details what they needed of the children. Lie detector I offered myself. Blood test I offered myself. I even offered the Home Office that I'll pay for the investigation for somebody to go from the Home Office. All these things weren't accepted.
They are cruel and they're bloody liars, the Home Office. That's what I think of the Home Office.
The more they, said no, the more determined I was to prove that, I'm not a liar. It's the government that is lying.
I'm going to fight till the last breath in my body. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep fighting on because they are my children. Nobody in the world can prove that they're not mine.
Bring Anwar's children home! Bring Anwar's children home!
So the last resort was going for internal medical examination to prove that I gave birth to more than 1 child. And that was the really, hard thing for me. That was really bad. It was like, how can I describe it? It was like being abused by consent. That's how I felt. By law, you can do this to me to prove that these are my children. And I can never forget that. Never.
In 1981, the Home Office finally surrendered to the weight of evidence.
The children arrived in Manchester 6 years to the day after they last saw their mother in Pakistan. Their father had flown over specially to collect them. At last, the reunion. Mrs. Dieter wept, the children were dazed, and they hardly remembered the mother who'd fought the Home Office for 6 years to bring them to England.
Even when I think about it, what I've been through, you feel so depressed and you say, what the hell? Why did I go through all this? All those questions wouldn't have arisen if I would have been white.
Okay, so I think you can see from that that this very ordinary woman, who'd had in many ways a very ordinary life, became this incredible campaigner. I think that you can see from the way that she speaks that there was a real reason that she really connected with people. So she went up and down the country. She spoke at trade unions, in libraries, in pubs, at all the other Asian youth movements events, but also at anti-racist events all over the country, and to white communities and trade unions, and also like through kind of media appearances, and really connected with people because they recognised her, they felt that she was familiar, and they believed that she should be reunited with her children. And so I'm going to base the rest of this talk around 3 ideas. So I've given you some background, and hopefully now I can try and suggest some of the things that might be useful or relevant to think about the Asian youth movements with now. So the first is that young people's ordinary knowledge gained from everyday life provides the training and the analysis and the skills to engage in organised political resistance. Second thing is that even though the Asian youth movements have been largely ignored, we still see their effects today in a whole range of things. I think Sivanandan's idea of the time lag is useful here. So there's been a kind of time lag, but it doesn't mean things have disappeared. It means that they've been doing this work that we can't see. It's kind of like the work underground is happening, but stuff's going to grow out of that ground. I'm going to mix the metaphors here, but maybe you'll just go with me. And the third thing is that the difference in how we think about politics now compared to the analysis and actions of the Asian youth movements might show us some of the changes and might point to both a kind of narrowing of our horizons and also perhaps a loss of political confidence. I know that seems a bit negative, but I think maybe we can turn it into something more positive. So I think that the experience of going to school in a racist country is what politicised the young people that went on to form these movements. In the early 60s, a group of white parents in Southall had complained to the Minister of Education, Edward Boyle, that they felt that their children's education was being negatively affected by the presence of South Asian pupils. There was no proof of this claim, there was no evidence. All the research done at the time and now says that the ethnic mix of school has no impact on the children's ability to read and write. But why let evidence get in the way of some good racism towards children? So Boyle's law was implemented, which stated that no school should have more than 30% immigrant children or children of immigrant background. So what that meant was that children as young as 4 were bussed out of their local area, so were put on buses in the morning, 4-year-olds, sent off, so there might be a school round the corner, but if that school already had 30% immigrant children, you could be sent off on a bus to a school 5-10 miles away. This happened all over the country for years. And no white children were ever bussed to change the demographics of a school. Incidentally, Asian students, South Asian students and students of other immigrant backgrounds were regularly put into remedial classes to learn English, even if they'd been born in England and spoke perfect English and could read and write fluently in English. But it was assumed that if you had brown or black skin, then you probably spoke terrible English and you probably needed to be in this special class. And so, if busing then was meant to avoid creating majority Asian schools, what happened in schools was a kind of de facto segregation. And that was designed to keep non-white children in subordination to their white counterparts. And so teachers were sometimes explicitly or implicitly kind of collaborated with this racism. Lots of stories of teachers not being able to learn the names of immigrant kids. Suresh Grover, who was involved in the movement in Southall, said that his teacher renamed him Billy. The novelist Hanif Qureshi often tells a story about how he spent all these years at school with his teacher referring to him as Pakistani Pete. And when I read these stories, I'm really reminded of that line in Line of Skepters when he says, like, when I was in school, being African was a diss, sounds like you're having trouble with my surname this, right? So this clearly continues. There's clearly still teachers who are like, maybe I could call you John, you know, that must be happening somewhere. And obviously white children follow the example set by those in authority, and so there's huge amounts of just playground bullying. And it was in this context that kids learnt to fight back. And there were, of course, also sympathetic teachers. And often those teachers didn't feel that they could challenge racism, but they did encourage the kids to challenge it themselves. And while I think now we'd be a bit shocked by that, I think in the end that was really what politicised young people, to organise themselves and to see themselves as to see it as the only way to respond to these conditions was to do something about it themselves. So there's a novel written by one of the Bradford 12 defendants, a novel called A Hand on the Sun by Tariq Mahmood. And in it, the kind of key turning point at the beginning of the book is this pitched battle between Asian and white students. And so it was this experience, I think, of fighting back that really gave people the sense that this was how it had to be done. So I'm just going to play a little clip that I think speaks to this.
Called names you've never heard of before. You know, getting spat at, dinner time, people walking past, spitting your food. And it was just terrible.
There was no policeman there to help you, no council person, there was no elder leadership there to help you. Once you crossed that school path, you were by yourself. You had to run to catch a bus, and you were being kicked, and you had people chasing you while you wanted to run to catch a bus.
We was young, we formed a gang, and what the Skinners were doing us, there was shout, you know, we're going Paki bashing today, we're going Paki bashing today. So we was going Skinner bashing. Because most of the time at night time they'll come in cars and everything, just to swear at us and find somebody on his own and beat him up. But then there was quite a few of us, we just stood around corners with bottles and bricks, and when you see the cars come in, let it go.
All right. So I think the thing that I find so compelling in this clip is partly his pride at the end, of course, when he says they were coming Paki bashing, we went skinhead bashing. Of course, there's a pride in that, but there's also, I think, something so shocking about looking at this uncle and seeing how much pain he's still in when he talks about his experience at school. I think it's really important to remember that generation have 40, 50 years of memories of being in this country and endured an awful lot that we don't necessarily hear that much about. And I think sometimes in people's individual families, these stories are told a little bit, sometimes they're told in more public ways, but most of them are really still in people's heads and are really still affecting how they interact with the world. So I think that you can kind of see what this guy's been through and how that might have produced the conditions in which you didn't trust the authorities to challenge things for you, and you realised that there wasn't really much option other than to link up with your friends and see what you could do together. So what have the longer term effects been of the Asian youth movements? Well, there are still some organisations that came out of that, of those campaigns. So Southall Black Sisters was also formed the day after Gurdeep Singh Chaggar's, or in the time after his murder, and that's still around doing domestic violence campaigning and casework, and was one of the important redresses to the terrible gender balance in the Asian youth movements. The Southall Monitoring Group, now just the Monitoring Group, I think, does police monitoring and work around racist violence, so they're still going. And I think beyond that, there's also just a generation of people of this guy's age now who are still around. So many of them involved in other kinds of work. Shahnaz Ali, who was the kind of 13th member of the Bradford 12, works in human rights. So, people are still kind of around. The second thing that I think comes out of the Asian youth movements that's worth us really thinking about quite carefully for how it might impact on our lives today is the state's strategy for responding to these young people, with a mixture of repression and criminalisation and co-option. And I think that combination is one that's still really, really effective. Maybe co-option's even more effective. So the criminalisation and repression is obvious enough. Kettling huge demos, snatch squads arresting 342 people. Really the kind of classic stuff that we see, in the way that also when the National Front came to town and the police came and didn't stop that happening, and largely, people say, defended the National Front, what you had was Asian communities under siege, right? So effectively, people felt that they were occupied territory. And so that's the most, I think, explicit form of repression that we can see. But the co-option, I think, is in some ways more interesting because it's more insidious. And so Anandi Ramamurthy in her book Black Star refers to this as buying activists off the street. I think it's a really useful term, to buy activists off the street. And so that's what they did. They flooded these groups with money. So you set up an Asian Youth Movements group in Burnley with 7 people. Someone from the council is going to come round and offer you £5,000. And that's what they kept doing. They kept giving them loads and loads of money. And what that meant was they went from being autonomous and self-reliant to being reliant on the state. And so Tariq Mahmood, who was the worker for the Asian Youth Movement group in Bradford, said that in the beginning, he was the worker and they all paid 25p into the pot every week, and that went towards his wage. And bear in mind, all of these young people are on the dole, basically, because unemployment's really, really soaring at that point. So that 25p was a sacrifice, but it was one they felt it was worth making. Then suddenly there's £3,000 in the bank account given to them by the state, and people don't feel that they can hold their one worker to account in the same way, because they haven't gone and given him that 25p in person. They didn't have a bank account, they just literally put it in a box and he got paid out of that box. So you had to go and give it out of your own pocket, and that meant that you had to speak to the guy that you were giving it to. So those kinds of connections were really important and sustained a sense of investment. And so campaigns against deportations, they used to have to fundraise to get a bus together so that they could take people on the bus to the court. But then the state started just putting on the bus for them, and then the buses are going half empty, right? So I think that was a strategy that came from colonial policy, right? It came from the idea of creating community leaders that act as the kind of the intermediary force between a people and the state. Thank you. And so I think this strategy they really finessed with the Asian youth movements. And I think we can see this later. So the Prevent strategy was introduced by New Labour, and it works along similar lines in the first instance, right? No one really knew what Prevent was about or for. It just kind of in the beginning just seemed like big pots of money for the Muslim community. So it was mostly used to like put on football tournaments and take kids to Alton Towers. But now, look at what it's done, right? It's become mandatory, and it's a kind of huge beast that's used as a kind of big surveillance mechanism that's really put a community, the entire British Muslim community, under constant surveillance with an enormous amount of infiltration. So I think we can see that money, which looks like this thing that we need, and you often hear activists talk about it, like, oh, if you want me to do something, pay me. Well, watch out for who's paying you, because if the state is paying you, there's a reason. And so when the state started paying these young people to do anti-deportation campaigning, remember, it's the state that's deporting people, and then if they're paying you to campaign against them deporting people, there's a reason. And it meant that people ended up doing things that were effectively social work, right? They would spend all their time doing casework, so all that autonomous action that they started with gets shut down. There's not time for it. So, where are we now? I think that's a kind of trickier question. I think we have moved towards strategies of state reliance, towards insularity, and that what that means is that we're more likely to look for recognition, yeah? We're more likely to want to be seen, and we're more likely to want to be represented, or to be those brown and black faces in high places, as it keeps being put, which I think is very helpful. And I think that more liberal demand for recognition means that it's almost difficult even to see and understand the anti-imperialist, anti-racist agenda of the Asian youth movements. But I think if we can go back and try and put ourselves back in their shoes, try and put ourselves back in that mindset, we can see a lot of other ways to think about the world. I think one of the things that really kind of indexes this for me was that in Dewsbury in 2012, 6 young Asian men, Pakistani guys from Birmingham, knew that there was going to be an EDL march in Dewsbury. So they thought, we're not having this, and they, again, made some petrol bombs. In a way, this is a talk based on people making petrol bombs. It's not that I'm recommending it, it's just that this is historically what's happened. And so they're off on the way to the demo, and they get pulled over for a driving offence. So it sounds like, I mean, really, it sounds like a bit of a Mickey Mouse operation if you're going to get pulled over for a driving offence when you've got a load of bombs in the back of the car. So they get arrested, and the next year, they plead guilty to engaging in preparation for acts of terrorism. They're each sentenced to 19.5 years in prison. And there was no suggestion by anyone, really, that these men were acting in self-defence. And I'm not convinced that they were acting in self-defence, you know? Like, they got in a car to go and find the EDL. The EDL weren't coming to their neighbourhood. So I'm not suggesting they were acting in self-defence. But I do think it's interesting that no one made the comparison with the Bradford 12. No one said, well, what are we going to do about racist violence on the street? And the fact that they're now doing 2 decades in prison each seems significant to me, you know? Because Muslim organisations, the Muslim Council of Britain, immediately distanced themselves from these groups, right? They said, no, these guys have nothing to do with us. These men are terrorists. We want nothing to do with them. The kind of like white lefty groups, Hope Not Hate, these anti-fascist groups said, nope, we want nothing to do with these men. They're not, this isn't anti-fascism, this is fascism. They said these guys are just as bad as the EDL. So everyone washed their hands of these men, right? Everyone said, nothing to do with us, this isn't what resistance looks like. I think that's important to think about, right? That it's really easy to disavow these things in the present, but if we look back at the history, there's always been more unruly parts of social movements. There's always been things that don't look quite like resistance, that don't seem to be the thing that we think of as campaigning, but actually, you know, that black pussy bourgeoisie, the people that end up talking on the BBC, those commentators, those guys that work for these different kind of liberal representative organisations, would they be there without the Asian youth movements? Would they be there if those guys hadn't burnt down that pub in Southall? Right? We don't know, but I think it's worth thinking about. And so I think that just this change, I think, is important, because I think we can see a move from the fight for... So now I think what we see is a kind of... people are asking to be respectable. They're asking to be recognised as respectable, as part of the nation. I think what's exciting about looking at these earlier moments of protest and of campaigns is that they weren't fighting for respectability, but they were demanding something. They were demanding respect, and they were going to take it. So I think I'm pretty much out of time, and I will leave it there. Thank you.